If you suffer from hip arthritis, your hip muscles tend to weaken over time due to pain and weakness. This process further destabilizes the hip joint. The hip muscles provide support for the hip joint. When those muscles weaken, the remaining hip cartilage is subjected to more and more pressure. As a result, the remaining cartilage wears away even faster. To slow down or even stop this degeneration process, we need to strengthen the muscles around the hip. The major muscle groups of the hip could be categorized by their actions. There are 5 general actions of the hip joint: flexion, extension, abduction, external rotation, and internal rotation. It is important to make sure the hip can perform all 5 of these movements, and it is important that we strengthen the muscles that help us perform these movements. We can categorize the hip muscles by their actions: hip flexors, hip extensors, hip abductors, hip external rotators, and hip internal rotators. Hip extensors make up for the largest muscle group in the hip. To strengthen the hip extensors, let's start with bend over hip extension. You start by bending over a table or a countertop. From here, swing your leg back toward the ceiling. Do 10 repetitions, then switch legs. Repeat this exercise for 3 sets of 10 repetitions. It doesn't really matter if you keep the knee flexed or extended for this exercise. You would strengthen your gluteus muscles either way. If you swing your leg straight back, you get a bit more gluteus maximus activation. If you swing your leg at an angle behind you, you get a bit more gluteus medius activation. To make bent over hip extension more difficult, you could either use an ankle weight or resistance band. The other hip extensor exercise that I like is supine bridge, also known as hip thrust. The reason I like this exercise so much is for 2 reasons. The first reason is that it is a very functional exercise. This exercise helps you improve your bed mobility. There are generally 2 ways to move around in the bed. One is to roll over, and the other is to scoot over. To scoot your body around the bed, you have to lift your hip up first. The second reason I like this exercise is because it is one of the most effective hamstring strengthening exercises. The hamstring muscles are attached to your hip region, and they are hip extensor muscles as well. If you have trouble doing the supine bridge due to weakness of the hips, you could start with a partial bridge. As your muscles get stronger with this strengthening exercise, you could transition to a regular bridge. If you want to target both gluteus medius and hamstrings at the same time during a bridge, you could put resistance band around your knees. Remember to keep the knees stable to avoid having the knees being pulled together by the resistance. A more difficult version of the supine bridge is single leg bridge. This version of the bridge doubles the difficulty of a regular supine bridge. Next, let's talk about how to strengthen hip abductors. The easiest way to strengthen your hip abductors is to start in the sitting position. Start with your feet flat on the floor, then push your knees out to the sides. When you push your knees out, you don't have to keep your feet flat on the floor. To make this exercise more effective for strengthening, you could put a resistance band around the knees. Push your knees out against the resistance, then relax and come back to the starting position. Repeat 10 repetitions for 3 sets. Another simple way to strengthen the hip abductor is in the standing position. You can hold on to a table or chair for balance. Swing your leg out to the side. Repeat 10 times and then switch legs. Repeat 3 sets for 10 repetitions. The important things to remember when doing this exercise is to make sure your hip is not drifting in front of you. Once your hip starts to drift forward, your hip flexors start to contract. Contracting the hip flexors makes strengthening the hip abductors much less effective. And to prevent this from happening, swing the hip out to the side and slightly behind you. As long as the hip goes slightly behind you, the hip flexors will not activate. To make this exercise more advanced, you can put an ankle weight around your ankle. Once standing hip abduction becomes too easy for you, you can do hip abduction in the sideline position. Lie down on your side, on the floor or on your bed. Lift the top leg up toward the ceiling as high as you can and then come back down. To make your posture more stable, you can bend the bottom knee. And like the standing version, the common mistake for this exercise is also having the hip drift forward in front of your body as you lift your leg up. To prevent this from happening, it is best to find a wall and keep your back and leg against the wall as you lift your leg up toward the ceiling. Make sure the back of your heel is in constant contact with the wall. To make this exercise more difficult, you can put an ankle weight around your ankle. To strengthen the hip flexors, my preferred exercise is marching in place and standing with high knees. I like this exercise because the hip starts in the neutral position and ends in a neutral position. To make this exercise a bit more difficult, find a wall and go into a wall plank position. From here, bring your knee toward your chest and then back down to the floor. Alternate with the other leg and repeat. This exercise is also called wall mountain climber. To strengthen the hip external rotators, the most common exercise is the resisted clamshell exercise. Put a resistance band in the loop and put the loop around your knees. Lie down on your back with your hips and knees flexed, feet flat on the floor. Start with your feet close together. Push your knees out against the resistance band and relax. Repeat for 5 to 10 repetitions for 3 sets. To advance this exercise, you can lie down on your side. Another relatively simple exercise for a hip external rotator is the hydrant. Start in the quadruped or hands and knees position. Bring your hip out to the side and then come back down to the floor. Repeat for 5 to 10 repetitions for 3 sets. To strengthen the hip internal rotators, the first one I would recommend is the lower extremity PNF D2 flexion. The first position is lying down on your back. Start with your knees extended, one leg crossed over the other, with toes pointing down toward your feet. And slowly flex your hip and knee together, and at the same time internally rotate your hips so your ankle swings out to the side of your body. Come back to the starting position with legs crossed. Repeat this movement for 10 repetitions for 3 sets. The other position for this exercise is the standing position. Stand on one leg with the other leg crossed in front, toes again pointed down. Slowly flex the hip and knee together at the same time, and at the same time internally rotate your hip. I like to call this the hacky sack exercise. This is one of the movements that you do to hit the hacky sack with your ankle if it flies behind you. If you grew up in China or Taiwan, you might recognize this is also a technique to keep jianzi in the air. The last exercise that I want to talk about is called the hip controlled articular rotations, or CARS for short. This is one of my favorite hip internal rotation exercises. However, it does not just work on hip internal rotators. It actually works on hip flexors, hip external rotators, hip abductors, and hip internal rotators. The only one it doesn't really work on is hip extensors, at least not in the standing position. Start in the standing position. First, flex your hip in front of you with your knee flexed, bringing your knee to your waist height. Then externally rotate the hip out like you're opening the door of a car. And from there, internally rotate your hip so the bottom of your foot now faces behind you. And then bring your hip back to the starting position, hence closing the door. Repeat the movement 10 times for 3 sets. If you do this exercise in the quadruped position, you could also activate your hip extensor, since you have to keep your leg up against gravity using the hip extensors. I have talked a lot about hip strengthening exercises in this video, but I also want you to know that stretching exercises are also very helpful for hip arthritis, especially if you have very stiff hips. If you feel like this video has helped you, please check out my other video on how to stretch the hip, as well as my video on how to massage the hip. I will put the links to these videos in the description, as well as in the comment section below.